Now we will begin with our first plenary talk, open lecture, delivered by Professor Gert-Jan van der Heiden. A few words about him. An interesting thing, to me at least, Gert-Jan van der Heiden holds a PhD in mathematics and in philosophy, of course. He is full professor of metaphysics at the Faculty of Philosophy, Theology and Religious Studies at Radboud University in Nijmegen since 2013. His main research interests are phenomenology, hermeneutics, and contemporary continental philosophy, often with a view to examining problems from metaphysics in light of them. Professor van der Heiden is the author of the volumes The Truth and Untruth of Language, Heidegger, Ricoeur, and Derrida on Disclosure and Displacement from 2010, Ontology after Ontotheology, Plurality, Event, and Contingency in Contemporary Philosophy from 2014, The Voice of Misery, A Continental Philosophy of Testimony, 2020, and his most recent volume is St. Paul and Contemporary European Philosophy, The Outcast and the Spirit. It appeared in 2023. He is the editor of the volume Phenomenological Perspectives on Plurality, appeared in 2015, and he also co-edited, for example, The Gadamerian Mind, appeared at Routledge 2022. The title of Professor van der Heiden's talk is Event, Contingency, and Witnessing. Please, Professor, deliver your talk.
Thank you for your kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, and I think I speak on behalf of all of us that you're hosting this excellently. It was a beautiful opening and a beautiful room to be in here together. So thank you so much for that. Let me begin. Can I close this screen? Yes? Or will something happen there? Okay, then I'll keep it open. I will keep it open. No problem. In 1975, the author Annie Dillard won the Pulitzer Prize for her book Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. In this book, as well as in other texts, she describes, interprets, and reflects on the events and the creatures she witnesses. This combination of description, interpretation, and reflection reflection in the German sense of Besinnung, grants these texts a specific testimonial quality. More than being merely narrative or merely fictional, they bear witness to what is, to what happens, and to what emerges. And they articulate the sense of the scenery in which Dillard participates because she is there at that specific time and place as spectator. There is one essay that speaks in an exemplary way to the theme I want to address in my paper today. It is not only exemplary of Dillard's style, but also explicitly thematizes her own status as a witness of the scenes and events that nature offers. And it does so in an awareness of the intrinsic difficulty for humans to account for what nature stages, of both the beauty and the horror that emerges in its exuberant, extravagant, squandering, and wasteful style. These scenes, as Dillard emphasizes, are not there for us. Rather, they, and I quote, are performed whether or not we will or sense them. Yet there is a particular possibility, effort, or task available to us when confronted with all that appears and emerges. Dillard writes, I quote, "The least we can do is try to be there and to discover at least where it is we have been so startlingly set down if we can't learn why." The intriguing title of the essay that I would like to take as my point of departure is Teaching a Stone to Talk. The title refers to a certain Larry, it's a pseudonym, who lives in Dillard's neighborhood and who lives alone with the stone, Dillard writes, a palm-sized oval beach cobble whose dark grey is cut by a band of white which runs around. She's a beautiful writer, also known as a wishing stone. It is this stone that this Larry is trying to teach to talk. Imagining what he wishes the stone to say, Dillard suggests, I think he's trying to teach it to say a single word, such as cup or uncle, end of quote. What to make of this odd, rather ridiculous attempt to make a stone talk? What is at stake in it? 2 pages later, Dillard recalls how in the 40s, an American psychologist and his wife tried to teach a chimp, actually, to speak. They indeed managed to teach the chimpanzee to say some simple words like cup. Both Larry and the American couple serve as examples of a more pervading human wish to make reality speak, to force non-human beings to speak in a human language. The whole inhuman array, this is Dillard's expression, the whole inhuman array, however, does not speak to us, does not address us in our human language. As we do not share this language with them, we moderns, or late moderns, cannot engage in a dialogue with them as we can with other people, or as we can with the texts handed down from the past or handed over from other cultures. There is something in the inhuman that resists this. Nature, as Dillard then puts it, is marked by silence. Not that there are no noises or voices, there are many of those, but they form no human words. With its noises and voices, nature rather murmurs. It mumbles as if its noises are suppressed or hushed voices. Dillard writes, as if someone were gagging the world. And especially when listening attentively, trying to perceive what these hushed voices are saying, nature appears to be mute or dumb. Human language and thought, Dillard suggests, cannot simply be presupposed in our experience of what happens, emerges, and exists. Dillard's reflections on this murmuring, and now I will become really philosophical and rather technical in a second, but Dillard's reflections on this murmuring silence of nature remind us of the words of Jean-François Lyotard, who, when interpreting the Aristotelian difference between phone and logos, notes, one could call it mute, so it's about the phone of the animal voices, so Aristotle is making that distinction. One could call it, so the animal voice, mute if one remembers that the root mu connotes the shut lips which signal that one stays silent or emits a mute sound. And from this root comes murmur and also mu and mystery, end of quote. What happens and moves in the world, what emerges, appears and makes noises, clearly affects us. Yet the effective perceptive dimension of the emerging of what is, the voices and noises reaching our ears, seem to be separated from, external to, or unreachable by human logos, human language and thought, in a particular way. In this sense, the human endeavor to make nature speak is both as ridiculous and as comprehensible as the attempt of Larry to teach a stone talk. Metaphysically speaking, this brings me to the second part of my talk. Metaphysically speaking, Dillard's experience of the murmuring silence of nature concerns the late modern impossibility to simply embrace Parmenides' thesis that being and thinking are one and the same. At least if we conceive thinking as human language and human thinking, and conceive being in terms of the whole inhuman array, as Dillard puts it. The unity of them, or the belonging together of them, can no longer be presupposed. This elementary metaphysical problem offers, I think, one framework to address the question and the role of the concept of the event in present-day thinking. How do thinking and being co-belong? How can human language and thought respond to the noises and voices of what appears and emerges without turning into an attempt similar to Larry's teaching a stone to talk? I want to give a philosophical reflection basically on that question. And allow me to become a bit more technical. Despite the different variations and present-day conceptualizations of the event, one characteristic or concern seems to be common to many, namely that the event is excessive with regard to a priori principles or preconceived notions guiding human thinking. Any event worthy of the name exceeds the principles and concepts that thought has a priori at its disposal to conceptualize, explain, describe, or know what appears and emerges in the world. While this claim is elaborated in different ways, it is often done, inspired by Heidegger, in reference to Leibniz's principle of sufficient reason. Event, Ereignis, or Evenement are negatively conceived as that which transgresses this principle. And this transgression, I think, confronts philosophy with a particular tension. On the one hand, the suspension of the principle of reason is needed to account for the event. And this suspension seems to accord with a new task that arises as soon as philosophy becomes aware that it cannot simply presuppose the correspondence of being and thinking, and that it is therefore at a loss with respect to the question of why, which in its ultimate metaphysical form reads, why is there something rather than nothing, which of course also inspires Leibniz's principle of reason. And Dillard already suggests a subtle reorientation of this question. If we can't learn why, we should try to discover at least where it is we have been so startlingly set down. That's the one hand. But on the other hand, Leibniz's principle is also the principium redendae rationis, the principle of giving reasons, of giving an account. Can we truly suspend also this and not lose philosophy itself? The philosopher Jean Grondin, in a rather critical reflection on philosophy's turn to the event, suggests that the concept of the event is highly problematic for exactly this reason. If there is one thing that philosophy and thinking cannot give up, it is its concern for giving accounts and giving reasons. How then to account for the event? It might not be enough, as for instance Jacques Derrida seems to suggest, to cultivate a receptivity or openness for what is unforeseeable and incalculable, for, as he puts it, taking into account what defies the principle of reason, insofar as reason is limited to giving an account. And so he's making an opposition between taking into account and giving an account. You can take into account what is incalculable, that's even the task of thinking, but you cannot give an account. I'm not sure whether that works at the end of the day. Should one not also, in one way or another, account for what emerges in response to the event and reflect on it, bezien? To unravel this tension, it might be helpful to be a bit more careful and to speak of, not simply of the principle of reason, but rather of certain interpretations of the principle of reason. And to consider with some precision which dimension, element, or characteristic of this principle is to be suspended. If the principle is crossed out without further qualification, the event can only appear as Abgrund or irraison. And a lot of the philosophies of the event love to talk about the abyss and the Abgrund and irraison. But I think this talk is not innocent. Meillassoux, I think, Quentin Meillassoux offers a characteristic example of such an unqualified dismissal of the principle of reason, when replacing the principle of reason by a principle of unreason, irraison, to account for the event and the absolute necessity of contingency. And he describes his new principle as follows, and I quote Meillassoux: "There is no reason for anything to be or to remain the way it is. Everything must, without reason, be able not to be and or be able to be other than it is." It is, in sum, the principle of the potentiality of being otherwise, pouvoir être autre. Yet what does this exactly mean? It seems to me, to put my cards immediately on the table, it seems to me that Meillassoux' principle of unreason basically offers little more than a secularized version of the conception of contingency with which late medieval and modern theories of voluntarism and divine absolutism confront us, and for which Leibniz's principle of reason, despite all the problems we may have with it, actually offered a solution. In fact, in order to avoid confusions, I think it is rather important to distinguish between what Heidegger has called in this context calculative thinking, and I will come back to this term, which is the only mode of thinking left to us humans in a world understood through the lens of voluntarism, and Leibniz's rationalistic thought that rather concerns the question of why. And this is not simply a calculative way of thinking, but is inspired by a metaphysical question. There is a distinction. So this rejection of calculative thinking, you can find it not only in Heidegger, but also in Hegel, and also in Leibniz, which I think is very, very interesting. And we need to think a little bit. And Heidegger tends to forget about that subtle distinction when he's talking about the principle of reason. The secret of Leibniz's principle of reason is found, as Heidegger puts it, in the expression potius quam, or rather than, as it appears in questions such as, why is there something rather than nothing? Why is this being so rather than otherwise? Leibniz's principle offers the ground of this rather than. Yet this rather than, and this is, I think, a technical point, but very important, is strictly speaking placed between logical or thinkable possibilities, between the possible worlds of which Leibniz speaks, which are equal in an absolute sense, or more precisely, de potentia dei absoluta, as the medieval philosophers would say. Considered in its absolute possibility, a being can be no less than not be. So no less than is here the opposite of rather than. So it can just as well not be. A being can be so, but just as well can be otherwise, absolutely speaking. Conceived as mere logical possibilities, it follows in its voluntaristic understanding that, and now I re-quote Meillassoux, everything must, without reason, be able not to be and or be able to be other than it is. I think there is a kind of an intrinsic connection between Meillassoux and this voluntaristic dimension, even though Meillassoux, of course, offers a secularized version of it. Confronted with the absolute equality of possible worlds and possible configurations, the voluntaristic God can simply take his pick arbitrarily without any concern for any human reason, because if we remove Leibniz's principle, there is none. There is only the ultimate abyss of arbitrary divine freedom, and there we have also a version of the abyss. In this case, there is no hope that being and human thinking will ever be able to meet, to correspond or to co-belong to what actually is. This idea motivates Descartes when he says that human reason should give up any hopes of knowing the divine plan. That is to say, of hoping to know the answer to the question of why, and that humans should limit themselves to knowing nature's efficient causality, that is to say, calculative thinking. Leibniz's correspondence with the Newtonian clock has made perfectly clear to which problems this type of voluntaristic thinking actually leads. A secularized version of this type of thinking, which perhaps also contaminates many conceptions of the event today, basically replaces the arbitrariness of divine freedom by sheer randomness. And I'm speaking here of Miklós as one example. And this sheer randomness is subsequently considered to be the essence of contingency. In this secularized version, all that is, and that is such and so, has no sense in itself, as it is conceived against the background of the absolute equal possibility of it being otherwise, which moreover can be actualized at any moment. After this somewhat technical exposition, let me try to give a literary example to flesh out a little bit what for me is at stake in this conflict. The novelist Paul Auster, the work of the novelist Paul Auster is marked, I think, by a particular obsession. It is actually haunted by the sheer randomness of events and how they impact and shape our lives. In interviews that he gave when his novel with the title 4321 was published, he told several times that this obsession actually originated in a traumatic experience from his teenager years. He visited a summer camp, and together with some other youngsters, he was, I quote, caught in an electric storm in the woods. And in order to get to a safer place, they crawled under barbed wire fence. And when the boy in front of Auster crawled under this fence, lightning struck and the boy died. Auster comments, "I've always been haunted by what happened, by the utter randomness of it. I think it was the most important day of my life." End of quote. Yet what does it mean to understand such an event in terms of its utter randomness? And now I'm perhaps a bit unkind to Auster, and I give a bit of a one-sided reading, but just to make my point, we can please correct me after the talk why I didn't read Auster properly enough. But I think it's interesting to see how Auster gives, which literary shape Auster gives to this obsession in the novel 4321. The numbers correspond to the 4 different lives that he describes of the protagonist Archibald Ferguson. In one of these lives, Archibald dies at the age of 13 in a comparable way to the boy from Auster's youth. In the other 3, Archibald lives different lives, all changed by the course of random events. While there are some constants in these 4 lives, their meaning fundamentally changes from life to life. At some point, the novel stages this dependency of human life on random events in almost Greek terms, as a tragic fate handed out to us by the gods. Yet from the composition of 4321 rather seems to speak an attempt to ward off the real encounter with the events that actually happen. After all, Archibald's existence is placed in the framework of the possible lives the author imagined. It is as if these narrated possible lives of Archibald Ferguson both evoke and aim to control the randomness of events. It is as if with each new imagined life, potentiality is given back to Archibald's existence, and the sheer actuality of the real is taken back in its imagined or logically conceivable possibility. Yet doesn't this imaginary withdraw from our view that for each of us there is only this life and not another, in which other possibilities are played out? Is the question of the event not in the first place a question of the encounter with the real, rather than a question of the sheer equivalence of logical imagined possibilities, of which the actualization is understood as being purely random? In Leibniz's Theodicy, the demiurge regularly returns to the palace of destinies, in which the pyramid of possible worlds is located. Each point of this pyramid in which Paul Auster's Archibald Ferguson exists corresponds with such story, of which there are not only 4, but actually infinitely many. Those who search for a principle of irraison, I would say, only flatten the pyramid, so that it has no longer any discernible peak or top, but they do not crush the a priori realm of the possible or the thinkable, and hence do not crush the primacy of the logical. And let me mention just between brackets that it comes to me as no surprise that while Miklós rejects the principle of reason, he maintains the principle of contradiction, which after all is the principle of logic par excellence. Randomness understood in this way belongs to the realm of thinkable possibilities, contingency and reality perhaps not. Along these lines of thought, it becomes clear why the suspension of the principle of reason without further qualification is basically the latest offspring of a logical thinking that proceeds from the absolute thinkability of what can be, that is, of the possible. And in exactly this way, it refuses to become a philosophy that takes its heat from what actually is, from what exists, emerges, appears, and can therefore be experienced. Perhaps we should conclude that the question of whether there are reasons or not for an event, that is, whether there are sufficient reasons or not for the actualization of this rather than that possibility or potentiality, is not exactly the right question. If this conclusion makes sense, neither the affirmative nor the negative answer to this question, stating respectively that the event has a reason and that the event is purely random, provides an answer that we are actually looking for. A metaphysics starting with logic starts with the primacy of the possible or the thinkable. Conceived in this way, not the actual or the real event itself is understood as the genuine Sache or subject matter for thinking, but rather the rule or the randomness by which the possible becomes actual. So let's turn to some other interpretations of this principle of reason, a different account, namely the one offered by Heidegger. And I want to say a couple of things about that. First in a negative way and then in a positive way, or that which Heidegger wants to get rid of in his critique of the principle of reason and that which he tries to save. And because Heidegger does not dismiss the principle of reason tout court, nor does he replace it by another speculative principle. He does not even suspend or abolish it as such. Heidegger is rather engaged in a reflection, a Besinnung on the principle. That is, in a critical explication of how this principle informs our relation to what is. He demonstrates how such a reflection interrupts and criticizes a prominent, dominant, late modern interpretation of the principle of reason. This repositioning, reinterpretation, and reflection on the principle is, I think, the true aim of Heidegger's account, for instance, in the Satz vom Grund. He confronts an interpretation of the principle, and with that of reason, ratio, and logos, that conceives of beings as being a priori calculable. Heidegger's succinct and clear description of the metaphysical, logical principle underlying this interpretation, as well as the mode of thinking, calculative thinking that goes hand in hand with it, reads as follows. It's a very short quote, but I think this is the heart of his interpretation. He writes, "Nothing is without reason. The principle now says that everything counts as existing if and only if it has been securely established as a calculable object for cognition." End of quote. I think this basically says exactly what calculative thinking is and what sense of being is projected in this way. The principle of reason thus ascertains in advance a particular co-belonging of reason and being. Calculative thinking corresponds to calculative or calculable, I should write, calculable beings. If we look a bit more carefully at the setup of this modern correspondence and Heidegger's interpretation of it, it seems to have all the characteristics of what Annie Dillard describes as teaching a stone to talk. The stone, or whatever being we encounter, is forced to speak the language of calculative human reason, of calculative logic. And perhaps it does not really matter whether this logic lets nature speak in deterministic or rather probabilistic terms. They are both under the control of calculation. And to capture this approach, and this is also, I think, at the background of Heidegger's interpretation, Kant's famous description of the relation of human reason and nature is exemplary. Kant acknowledges, of course, human finitude and affirms Descartes' claim that humans cannot know the why of the divine order of all that is. To be finite means that human reason depends on nature, at least for empirical knowledge, because unlike divine reason, it did not generate or create what it intuits. As it did not create nature, reason is empirically dependent on nature for any knowledge of it. Nevertheless, and this is a very famous quote that I will come to in a second, Kant insists that reason is not taught by nature. Reason is not supposed to let the phenomena appear or speak themselves, but reason rather extracts information from nature. Reason does not listen to the language of nature itself because, much like Dillard suggests in the opening pages of her essay, the murmur of things and the hum of nature is, in its Kantian, empiristic, sensualist conception, not a language at all, but basically a form of muteness, dumbness and silence, from which humans cannot learn anything. Therefore, as Kant insists, human reason teaches the natural phenomena to speak. Reason approaches nature with its own rational principle, as Kant notes, and now I give the quote, in order to be instructed by nature, not like a pupil who has recited to him whatever the teacher wants to say, but like an appointed judge who compels witnesses to answer the questions he puts to them. Nature is here portrayed as a witness, not free to say what it wants or what it deems necessary to say. It cannot even speak itself. To be a source of knowledge, the testimonies of natural phenomena and of the instruments that science uses to conduct its experiments are extracted according to the principles of reason. Beings, in this case natural phenomena, are in advance or a priori determined as object, that is, as that which speaks in terms of calculative logic. And it's not so strange that Heidegger then starts using in this context the term Herausforderung. Beings are challenged and forced to address the questions posed by reason and to respond in the calculative logic language of human knowledge. Yet this Herausforderung does not overcome the murmuring silence of nature. It rather strengthens the sense that it is as if someone were gagging the world, to use Dillard's expression once more. Alexandre Poiré characterizes the outcome of this modern scientific approach to reality and its accompanying mathematization of nature as follows. I quote, "At the end of this development, we find the mute and terrifying world of Pascal's Libertin, the senseless world of modern scientific philosophy." And then very dramatic, "At the end, we find nihilism and despair." End of quote. In his response to this paradigm of calculative thinking, Heidegger does not abolish the principle of reason, but rather interrogates it, critically explicates it, in order to allow its primordial sense to come into view. In this primordial sense, it is neither the principle of a calculative logic nor the principle of the why. And in this context, Heidegger cites the famous phrase from Angelus Silesius. And I want to think a little bit about that with you. Die Roos ist ohne Warum, sie blüht, weil sie blüht. The rose is without why, it blooms because it blooms. By translating the German weil as because, this phrase captures a specific characteristic of the event. In fact, the very phrase "it blooms because it blooms" resounds, for instance, in Claude Romano's characterization of the event, who writes, "With an event, one can only say one thing: it has its cause in itself. That is, strictly speaking, it has none." End of quote. Here, Heidegger's concern is not so much that one cannot ask the question of why the rose blooms, it seems to me. One can, obviously, and in fact, one does, for instance, in biological research. We ask the question. Heidegger's concern is rather metaphysical in nature and aims to show that the question of why is not the ultimate or primordial question. It can only be asked based on, or grounded in something else. That is to say, the question of why retrieves its possibility, sense, and orientation from another ground or from another sense of the ground. And it is this other ground that Silesius die Roos ist ohne Warum articulates. The phrase thus enacts an epoche, it suspends and interrupts the search for causes, reasons, and grounds, but in a particular sense, which I would like to interpret in the following way. I think it interrupts, so Silesius' phrase, interrupts the search for something else than what appears to account for what appears. And in that sentence, the search for something else than what appears to account for what appears, the emphasis should not be placed on to account for, I think that's not the issue, as if there is no account of a blooming rose possible. Rather, the emphasis is to be placed on for something else. The voluntarist finds this something else in arbitrary divine freedom, the Leibnizian in a rational divine will, the atomist in the sheer randomness of atomic movements and collisions. It is this tendency and orientation to something else than that which actually appears that Silesius' phrase interrupts. Heidegger Silesius thus demands that we rethink what it means to account for something, to account for an event like the blooming of the rose. And let me recall once more, I did it already twice, but once more the words of Annie Dillard. If we can't learn why, thought needs to be reoriented and adopt a different task, namely to discover at least where it is we have been so startlingly set down. Before we even can ask why, we find ourselves amidst blooming roses in this example. We are there where the roses bloom. We are there with the blooming of the rose. A blooming which Heidegger describes as das reine aus sich aufgehen und scheinen, the pure emerging and appearing from itself. With respect to this pure emerging and appearing, the German weil has something in store for us that the translation because perhaps hides. Weil in German is related to weilen and verweilen, to repose, to linger, or to abide. I don't know what the best translation in English is. The rose is there while it emerges and appears. It is there whether anyone is watching or not. Yet if we find ourselves also there, if we are there where the rose blooms, emerges and appears, it draws us to it. It is thanks to this emerging and appearing that we can be drawn to it in the first place, and that we participate in the view that is offered on the ground of this emerging and appearing, to which the rose that offers itself to be viewed, perceived, and experienced belongs, and to which we belong when we are with the rose, drawn to it because and while it emerges. During the while of its bloom, we can be there with the rose, participating in the spectacle of its appearing. And to emphasize how and that this understanding of ground is no longer that of calculative logic or of the why, Heidegger writes, however, in order to be a rose, that is, in order to bloom, the rose does not need expressly to represent the ground of its blooming. End of quote. A representation is the mark of logical thinking for Heidegger. It concerns the a priori thinkability of the rose as possible. The primacy of logic is suspended here in favor of the primacy of a certain ontology, in the sense of the emerging and appearing of what is. Heidegger emphasizes too that this interruption of logical thinking does not erase the principle of reason. He writes, the fragment, the roses without why, does not disavow the principle of reason. End of quote. There lurks, in that sense, no principle of irraison or unreason in Heidegger's account. He has understood that the task of thinking cannot be found in a reiteration of the absolute equality of whatever is possible or thinkable. With respect to the event, the task of thinking is not to decide whether the alternatives, it can be so and it can be otherwise, should be connected by the phrase rather than, or by the phrase just as well as. Contingency is a question neither of divine will nor of random movement. Contingency concerns that which is there, which exists during the while of its emerging and appearing. Even though it once was not, and at some point might no longer be, it emerges here and now, showing itself, drawing to it those that happen to find themselves in its vicinity. In this sense, the secret of the principle of reason, its rather than, is actually somehow preserved. But it is no longer placed between two possibilities. Contingency concerns the prevalence of what actually emerges. What surprises those who are drawn to the blooming rose is not that the possible world in which the rose exists is either equal to or higher than the possible world in which it does not. Rather, what surprises them is the sheer encounter with the blooming of the rose. The experience that the rose blooms rather than not. That it is there, real, draws us to it so that we can experience it. And what we experience, and I think this is also an important aspect, what we experience is not simply its existence distinguished from its essence. This distinction between existence and essence no longer makes real sense, because the event is rather the self-offering of the rose as blooming, as a blooming rose. It is the self-offering of this sense. It lets this sense to be experienced so that it can be understood, that it can be reflected on. Let us return to Dillard's teaching A Stone to Talk. Up to now, I've only said something about the first pages, about the muteness and the silence of nature. But Dillard offers something else, which I think is an important follow-up on what we said about Heidegger. And first, I will show you that in the first part, that she reiterates what Heidegger says, but then in the second part also adds something important to Heidegger's understanding. The mute silence that Dillard experiences at the heart of the murmuring noises of reality incite her to seek for another human comportment to what is, to what happens, emerges, appears, and resounds, namely one that does not give in to the temptation of making phenomena speak, of turning them into Kantian witnesses that are interrogated by a tribunal that imposes its language on them. It is as if Dillard wants to begin anew, almost as if repeating what Husserl says. I quote, "The beginning is pure," Husserl writes, "and so to speak, still dumb experience." So pure experience, but still dumb experience, which is now to be brought to a pure articulation of its own sense, end of quote. And basically, all the things that I will say is kind of an interpretation or explication of this phrase of Husserl with the help of Annie Dillard. The beginning is a pure and dumb experience, which is now to be brought to a pure articulation of its own sense. The world is not only the material for human plans, actions, uses, inventions, or manipulations. Rather, when the attempts to teach a stone to talk crumble down and fail, the possibility of another comportment opens up. One that strives to simply take in what appears, that lets itself be drawn by what draws us first. This comportment is openness and receptivity to what lies beyond the reach, or the a priori reach, of language and logic. This a priori addition is important. Not the phenomena should be interrogated as witnesses, but we ourselves should become witnesses, not in a legal, but in another sense. To simply take in, look at, and participate in what emerges is to witness what appears. As Dillard writes, and I quote, "We are here to witness. There is nothing else to do with those mute materials we do not need. All we can do with the whole inhuman array is watch it. We can stage our own act on the planet, build our cities on its plain, dam its rivers, plant its topsoils, but our meaningful activity scarcely covers the terrain. We can only watch them," that is, all these elements of the inhuman array, "whoever they are," end of quote. And Dillard then goes on to tell, it's just a short story, so you should definitely read it, I think. But she then goes on to tell that she travels to the Galapagos Islands, well known from Darwin's work, as it is the place where the eventful character of nature, with its foreign and seldom variety of animal and plants, is fully on display. I quote, "The Galapagos Islands are just plain here, and little else. They blew out of the ocean, some plants blew in on them, some animals drifted aboard and evolved weird forms, and there they all are, whoever they are, in full swing. You can go there and watch it happen and try to figure it out. Whatever happens on those bare volcanic rocks happens in full view, whether anyone is watching or not." End of quote. Aristotle distinguishes between theoria, poiesis, and praxis, three realms with each its own form of knowledge and its own particular good or goal. The only conceivable comportment to what truly is, let's say the eternal for Aristotle, is the theoretical one. I mean, after all, with respect to the eternal, all human attempts to make or act are obviously futile. Dillard suggests that something similar applies to the utter variety of forms of being that we encounter in reality, whether alive or not. This variety far transgresses the realm of human fabrication and action. Therefore, the only conceivable comportment of the human to this variety, as it transgresses human making and acting, is also, I would say, theoretical, albeit in a slightly different and perhaps even more primordial sense. The Greek theoria is derived from theoros, the one who travels to Delphi to consult the oracle, or who travels as a delegate to another place to participate in its religious festival. That is to say, to participate not as an actor, but as a witness. Dillard herself, traveling to the Galapagos Islands to participate in the spectacle thus offered by nature, is such a theoros. Confronted with the spectacle, it is not so much nature that falls silent, but rather humans themselves. They are struck dumb by what shows itself. And Dillard now speaks of, and I quote, "the muteness of the human stance in relation to all that is not human." We are, in a sense, mere visitors of a strange, remarkable island and try to figure out where we are and what the sense is of what appears there. With respect to what happens in full view, human reason is not marked by a spontaneity with which it creates the principles according to which it will interrogate the phenomena. Rather, as theoros or witness, we are marked by a fundamental passivity. The witness is simply the one who is there, present with what happens and emerges. The witness is drawn by the spectacle, drawn in by that which triggers, affects, and appears. And all these elements are drawn from Gadamer, so that's why I also want to add one comment on Gadamer. For Gadamer, this human being there with, or being present with, dabei sein in German, this human being there with what appears, defines the theoros and also forms the very heart of metaphysical, even of metaphysical theoria. Theoria is true participation, not some, this is Gadamer, theory is true participation, not something active, but something passive, pathos, namely being totally involved in and carried away by what one sees, end of quote. Yet, what one sees has sense. The senses, after all, offer something in its full sense, offer that which appears as significant and meaningful. Therefore, this participating passivity and mute stance of human witnesses does not remain silent. From it, words are born. Language is born. In the introduction, perhaps you remember, I quoted Lyotard on muteness and murmuring. Yet I left out the final part of this quotation, and I will now read the quotation in full. One could call it mute if one remembers that the root mu connotes the shut lips which signal that one stays silent, silent or emits a mute sound. From this root come murmur, mu, mystery, and the Low Latin mutum, which has, in French, given us the word mot. The word, in this French etymology, is born from murmur, from mumbling, from lips that are first shut, as long as the human witness is captivated by what the spectacle offers, but which subsequently open. What the event of witnessing offers does not simply disappear when the sight is no longer there, or when we are no longer present at this particular place. What is offered strikes us with muteness because it strikes us with significance. With this significance, it makes a claim on the witness, beyond the confines of the private moment in which it is witnessed. To witness something, to use Gadamer's expression, is therefore also to experience a claim to permanence. Anspruch auf Dauer. What we have seen has a significance beyond the moment of witnessing alone. Therefore, as Gadamer adds, he does it very quickly without really elaborating on it, but he adds, this claim to a permanence is also a permanence of the claim. What does that mean, and how does that come about? It means first that what is witnessed is not simply or quickly forgotten, as happens to many things that we only see in passing or out of curiosity, but is rather remembered, kept in mind as something significant, whether it is precious, beautiful, horrific, abyssal, or significant in yet another sense. The significance also demands further explication and sharing. It requires to be put into words. The witness is not only the one who witnesses, but also the one who gives an account of what was witnessed. It is not enough just to take into account that something unforeseeable or incalculable may happen, as Derrida suggests. When an event takes place, when something emerges that proves to be a genuine experience, thwarting our expectations, it demands interpretation, explication, and articulation. It demands an account. The words to articulate this account are not possessed in advance. They are born from the muteness with which we witnessed and experienced what appears. Words that articulate, interpret, explicate, and unfold the sense disclosed in the eventful spectacle, thus allowing others to participate in it, even if they did not witness the event themselves. Dillard's texts are exemplary forms of bearing witness or giving an account in this way. They save from oblivion what was witnessed and give a permanence to the fleeting and transitory nature of what comes into existence and departs from it again. It is for this reason that I think that when Gadamer says a claim to permanence is a permanence of the claim, that we need to add something. And I think that Hannah Arendt offers us the articulation of what needs to be added in this way. It is exactly for this reason, for this saving from oblivion, that Arendt speaks very highly of the historian Herodotus, who wrote about the events and deeds of humans. I quote Arendt. Herodotus wanted to say what is, because saying and writing stabilize the futile and perishable, fabricate a memory for it. For in the Greek idiom, mnemen poiestai. Yet he never would have doubted, Herodotus never would have doubted, that each thing that is or was carries its meaning within itself and needs only the word to make it manifest. End of quote. Perhaps Arendt's remarks, because they are limited to human deeds and actions, perhaps Arendt's remarks can be extended beyond the sphere of human deeds, plans, and makings. There is an element of sense, a sense arising in and as the event of witnessing, in which humans participate, from which they speak when they bear witness to what they perceived or experienced. The poetic creation at the heart of bearing witness, to which Arendt rightfully points, is concerned with making manifest or disclosing this sense, explicating it, sharing it. It is concerned with what Heidegger calls waren and bewaren, with protecting and preserving the sense with which being emerged, so that its claim can indeed become permanent. is extended beyond the confines of the witness experience alone and is described in the world we share with one another. Also in this latter sense, the witness is called to say what is. As Arendt notes, I quote her one more time, no permanence, no perseverance in existence can even be conceived of without humans willing to testify to what is and appears to them because it is. End of quote. What is granted permanence in this way? It is not simply about preserving historical facts or fixing objects. The permanence concerns a demand intrinsic to what is witnessed, residing in all sense, whether experienced or articulated, namely, I would say, a claim to understand. After all, the human is the animal with logos. When the word is born from a dumb experience, from a particular silence, when the word says what is, it also preserves this silence and the significance that resides in it. The word never fully captures or fully says, but rather hands it down, also silently. As Claude Romano writes, and I quote, behind all attempts to say something, there rustles a silence nothing can break, and that each word in its own way prolongs and perpetuates, end of quote. This silence is thus not mere silence. Rather, it is the silence of a sense witnessed, of a significance experienced, that, as such, is and remains a demand to understand, to explicate, to articulate, and to share, and in this way a continuous demand to give an account. As beings who can understand and who can give accounts, we participate in, as Gadamer puts it, the absolute openness of the sense event, Sinngeschehen, the event of meaning as it is sometimes translated. Only in this determination of the event as sense event, the question of the co-belonging of being and thinking can be posed once more in the form of event and understanding. Any event worthy of the name is a sense event, Sinngeschehen, in which we participate as witnesses who first experience in order to recount, interpret, and understand what happens and what appears in the strange places in which we find ourselves. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. It was highly thought-provoking. So please raise your question.
My question is, you called in question the statement about the reason for an event. How does it correlate with the principle of cause and effect? Is it the same? The reason and content, cause and effect events.
Mm-hmm. Well, so I mean, it depends a little bit on who you ask, but for instance, if we would take a Kantian approach, so the idea of causality for Kant is, let's say, a limited version of the principle of reason. And so a version that... It is a particular case, and at least for Kant, because he needs to limit it so that causality can be used in the project of knowing things. And Kant wants to get away from the metaphysical meaning of the principle of reason, which of course is essential to Leibniz. Yes, yeah. But of course, I mean, but it also depends on which author you interrogate, because the notion of cause and ground and reason, they sometimes are used as synonyms and so on. So you have to be a bit careful, but Kant offers a clear distinction, which I think is helpful, that causality is something that is studied by the natural sciences, and they do it well. But then the question is still open for us philosophers. What is the metaphysical meaning and dimension of this principle of reason? Yes.
Probably I will frame my question badly, poorly. I'm just talking about an intuition. I liked very much when you said that you interpreted contingency toward the issue of emerging phenomena. The rose is blooming. Okay, phenomenon is middle voice. It is appearing by itself, as itself. But I have the impression that this sense of contingency should be different regarding natural phenomena and regarding moral or human existential phenomena. I really think that whenever we understand something regarding ourselves, that's a similar emerging. That's a phenomena as well. But the sense of contingency should be different. Towards the emerging of the rose blooming, I can have a rather distanced aesthetic relation. Towards my own moral phenomena, I cannot distance myself. So there should be a difference. But this is only a particular issue of the whole thing. You really touched upon really broad questions, so many issues could be addressed.
Yes.
So far.
Well, thank you. And one of the reasons I'm happy with this question, because one of the reasons that I decided to take Annie Dillard as my point of departure is exactly because she is focused on nature, and I think, yeah, well, of course, it depends a little bit on what we mean with the word aesthetic, but I think that her relation to nature is not simply aesthetic. It is. Unless we want to understand aesthetic in the wide Gadamerian sense of the word, as a fundamental form of teilhabe. And I think that if you take that approach, then you don't give up nature, let's say, to a not well understood form of theoretical knowledge, but show that our relation itself to what appears and how we are affected by it is actually part of that aesthetic experience understood in the right way. And so what I would like to do is, of course, I mean, if you then ask the question about morality, I think that's a later question. But I think that it grows out of this particular way of encountering that which approaches us. And so, of course, I gave and that's one of the problems with taking this example of the rose. Is of course it's this beautiful blooming rose. Oh, it's so nice and so on. It was there in Heidegger. But if you read Dillard, for instance, if you read Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, the book is basically divided up in two parts. The first part is a little bit this, oh, how nice and beautiful nature is, and then the second part, the horrendous or the horrific dimension of nature comes out. And I think that also has an impact of the human who lives there with nature, which existentially impacts. And so, whereas of course the example of the blooming rose it's very nice, but there is another impact of the event possible, which can be traumatic, for instance, in nature. But I think that these two elements belong to the same relation. And they belong to the same relation because human experience is fundamentally finite. It is not given in advance that which appears, that we can indeed develop the receptivity. But that, I think, is exactly what is at stake in this notion of the event. That you do not know in advance whether being and thinking co-belong. It's rather the task of seeing whether it is possible, yes or no. And so basically, I would like to bring these two elements closer together. So this contingency with respect of nature and this contingency with respect to our own existential dimension. I think that they belong together. Yeah. I mean, this is that's what I'm interested in, to see whether that's possible. Yeah.
One small follow-up: is the notion of witnessing enough? Is it? I mean, that's tricky again.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I like. I mean, yes. I mean, there is a. Well, I mean, witnessing is a very broad notion, and there's a lot to say. But one of the things that I like about the notion of witnessing, I think it has its own mediality, because on the one hand, it is passively undergoing something as a witness. Which can also turn us into a victim if it's something horrendous that happens. But it's also, if the phenomenon is full, it's also actively articulating, bearing witness, and rendering it into words. So this is one of the reasons why I like this notion of witnessing, because it has this mediality, and it allows us to think on the one hand, the receptivity of the human, and on the other hand, the poetic activity that is necessary to bear witness. And then, of course, one can ask the question whether in all cases the one who suffers or undergoes something is also the one who can speak about it. No, that's not the case. And there's literature, a lot of literature about it. But it's all discussed under the heading of the problem of witnessing and allows us to analyze. Allows us to analyze also the limitations of this notion. And I think that's important. Yeah.
Witnessing could be even traumatic.
Yes,
stopping, bringing the phenomena to logos.
Yes.
Stopping it. Okay,
Yes.
Thank you very much. Please.
Thank you. My name is Eli Holzer. Thank you again for your presentation. Like Miklós, I think I'll need a little bit more time to encompass all of it, and hopefully we'll be able to read it sometime. As you said, the word and the verb of witnessing is very rich, of course. And one of the reasons also that I find it attractive, it has some echoes or reverberation from the biblical context, of course.
Yes.
In other words, I could see a journey exploring event because there is no metaphysics, at least at hand, and then circling back to a certain kind of language that invites for it. What I haven't heard you using, and I was just wondering how would you think about that, you described and you use witnessing for the actual moment of the experience. Then you use words like reflecting, etc. You haven't used the verb to testify, and you haven't related to the language that would express, even in written form, the witnessing moment as a testimony. Would that be something you would have been thinking about, and what would that actually mean in that context?
Yeah. Well, thank you for that question. So my mother tongue is Dutch, and so in Dutch we would not distinguish in that way between to witness and to testify. So for me that is, in that sense, always a struggle for me. What is the right notion to use? But definitely the notion of testimony is very important, because in testimony something is made public, and especially if it's written testimony, it also remains public. It remains there, and so everybody needs to relate to it. And so that aspect was is especially important for the last part of my talk. So there is a claim to permanence. That is to say, something that somebody experienced needs to be kept alive, needs to be remembered. But that needs to become a permanence of the claim. And how can it become a permanence of the claim? How are people still drawn to what happened, for instance, in the past, and that we should not and are not allowed to forget? Well, that is thanks to testimony. It's thanks to writing it down. So I did it now with Arendt and her comments on Herodotus, but there is a lot of literature on this, especially in continental philosophy. And so I think since the 1980s, 1990s, beginning perhaps with Lyotard, Le Différent, this is a very important topic. So yes, testimony is a crucial notion for me. The first part of your question about the religious dimension of it, I think that what I did not touch on at all in my talk is that there are, of course, several authors who move exactly in that direction, also in continental philosophy. So the predecessor is Kierkegaard in that respect. So for instance, in Fear and Trembling, when he speaks about Abraham, he calls Abraham a witness. Yeah? But he says then, but Abraham is not a teacher. And this is interesting, because that means that the witness who experiences it is not the one, according to Kierkegaard, who can articulate it. And there I start feeling a bit nervous. Because I think it is important that human, because it draws the experience out of the realm of understanding, out of the realm of something that can be shared, and so on. So there is a worry. But also later thinkers like Lévinas or Marion, of course, play with this relation between event and witnessing or testimony, and there is clearly a religious resonance in their work. So there's a lot there, but I did not touch on that at all in this paper.
Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. Elena Bartolini. Thank you, Professor van der Heijden. That was a wonderful presentation and a very interesting talk. I've been working on Heidegger, but I'm not very much familiar with his lectures on Leibniz. And you mentioned during your presentation that according to your understanding, he's missing something with the principle of reason. And I would like to hear more because it was very quick and I would like you to deepen that. And also I wonder, so if I'm correct, those lectures date back to the 50s, right? Mm-hmm. So I wonder if his reading of the principle of reason there and this calculative understanding of reason is a way for him to detach from thinking as reasoning and as an attention to discrete entities. And so a way to go back to this other beginning where his focus is not on beings, but more on being and all that kind of thinking that tries to detach from reason. Is that clear, the question? Or well, should I? Is my question clear?
Yes.
Okay.
The question
Thank
is
you
clear.
very much.
Yeah, definitely. So, as for the first question, what Heidegger misses, I think it's a relatively small point, but I think it's a point which has had its impact on, let's say, post-Heideggerian thought, namely that the principle of reason is understood as strictly as a principle of calculative thinking. And I think that if you read Leibniz, the question is, what do we mean with calculative thinking? And so in this correspondence with Clarke, he says, well, you Newtonians, you only have mathematical principles. And so you only have the principle of contradiction. But that's not enough. Otherwise, you will end up in a voluntaristic, absolutist conception. We need an additional metaphysical principle, the principle of reason. And I think that what Heidegger is doing is perhaps, I think that he doesn't make the distinction between calculative logic on the one hand and Leibniz's question of the why on the other hand. He conflates those two. And he gives this very nice quote of about, I can't cite it by heart, but about that Leibniz gives, that the world comes into existence while God calculates or something, so, roughly speaking. But if you look it up, so I thought, let's look it up. Did Leibniz really say? It's just a marginal comment in a dialogue which is not about this metaphysical issue. And and then I wonder, Heidegger, are you not going a little bit too fast there? And at the same time, I understand what Heidegger is doing, because I think what Heidegger is doing when he says that this principle of reason is a principle of calculative thinking, I do think that he has a good sense of how it actually played out after Leibniz. So because Leibniz didn't win, the Newtonians won. So at the end of the day, this is the perspective. So Heidegger, I think, is dealing with that. But sometimes I think that Heidegger could appreciate Leibniz a little bit more in that respect. As for the second question, yes. So, for instance, if you read this shorter essay at the end of Der Satz vom Grund, you see that Heidegger indeed ends with a very intriguing comment that goes indeed in the direction of this notion of the other beginning. But it's very short and very enigmatic. And of course, the question is, what does other beginning mean? And for me, for me, what is important is always that in one of these late essays, the title reads of Heidegger, late essay of Heidegger, The End of Philosophy and the Task of Thinking. And I have sometimes the impression that we have a tendency to only remember the first part. Yeah? And I'm not even sure whether I agree with Heidegger that we can simply separate philosophy and thinking. I think that's artificial. I mean, I understand why he does it, and there are good reasons, of course, strategically to do it. But I would like to emphasize the second part, so the task of thinking. So that means that even if we speak about another beginning, in terms of Ereignis and so on, it requires of us a thinking attitude. And so in that sense, of course you can think about the question, what does thinking mean there, but it's not Kierkegaardian faith or something like that. And it's also not simply the same as Levinasian responsibility, for instance. And I also don't think it's the same as what somebody like Marion is doing. It is a way, this is how I would read it, but perhaps then I'm not radical enough, but I would read it as a reinterpretation of Logos, as what defines the human being. And there will be resistance from several Heideggerians when you say that, but well, this is how it is. Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Amisha. I'm from India. So I really enjoyed the session. I had a question regarding your idea of witnessing. You mentioned that the witness is also imbued with the responsibility of making the perishable last longer by way of saying or writing. This has echoes to the Vedantic tradition of the witness or someone who channels the truth as a person who has gone through that rite of passage and has earned the right to be a witness. So I would like your views on the idea of eligibility of witnessing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that is the question. Thank you.
Yeah, this is something that I learned when reading Romano's books. Because you speak about the witness as the one who has a specific experience and is transformed, and is that for that reason is the one who should channel the truth. And I think that's in this notion of experience, there is the notion of peril. So there is the notion of running a certain risk, that is to say, going beyond that which is everyday or normal. And it's exactly in this very strong sense of experience, the witness has undergone something that especially the witness is supposed to speak about. Of course, this does, at the same time, I want to add that, is when I speak about the notion of the demand made on the witness, this itself is also a problematic notion, and this is something that, for instance, on which, for instance, Lyotard has already said a lot when he asked the question why certain witnesses do not testify. What's the reason? There can be different reasons. So also there we need to become more specific to grasp this specific sense of this demand. But there resides something of the demand, I think, and in witnessing, and that has something to do with what Derrida, I think, has seen very clearly. Derrida says that, and he's then, I think, in conversation with Heidegger, who says, of course, in relation to our death, we cannot give our death to anybody else. We cannot transfer it to anybody else. So it makes us unsubstitutable. Well, says Derrida, and I think he's absolutely right, to be a witness is also, it makes us also into something unsubstitutable, somebody who cannot be, and nobody else, I should phrase it like that, nobody else can take over my task to bear witness. And in this, there is something singularizing in witnessing, which I think makes it a very important phenomenon. And so it's not only our relation to death, but also our relation to what appears around us, and which we undergo in a specific, singular way. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. My name is Anakin, and I must say, just similar like for my colleague, I need to read the whole because I'm a little bit confused, but I want to come to the last part of your talk, which ended, to my mind, with an interesting Kantian gesture, if I may say that, because you just said, event is like, it must be sensual at some point. But there is, I think in your talk, a kind of tension. A tension marks the talk. And because in a part of the talk, you were talking about muteness.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the other part where a question arises for me is the relationship between the experience and the sense. I mean, if we are Kantians and so strict like Arendt, we just refuse, okay, there is no difference between experience and being, and senses equal experience. But for Heidegger, for example, there's a category of Erfahrung der Wesung des Seins. I don't know how to translate it in English, probably something like experience of a sensing of being. Mm-hmm. So then it must mean that experience is not equal sense. And the question that I would like to pose is, how do you stand to this opposition, and what kind of category is event for you? It's a category which is limited to the senses, sensuous, or a category of experience which can also be exempt or withdrawn from sense? So this is a part which would really be interesting.
Yeah. So I think so. That's a question about the notion of the event, and the notion of sense. I think that there is a tendency in Kant's description of experience to buy into a more or less sensualist, empiristic account of experience, so that we are only triggered by all kinds of things, and then the subject has to make sense of it. If you phrase experience and sense in that way, then sense is a product. Well, I mean, it's a bit exaggerated, but it's a product of the subject, let's say. And I think that what is at stake in phenomenology is, I think, that sense is something given. Yeah? So in Heidegger you have, already in Being and Time, you have zu verstehen geben. Yeah? So giving to understand. I like that expression. I don't know whether it's proper English actually, but it's proper German and proper Dutch, so I can think about it. But giving to understand, that means that there is a sense which may be vague, implicit, unclear, and so on, but that is what we encounter in experience. It's not brought in by us, but it's given. And so you see that then the notion of sense is already a little bit repositioned. That, I think, is very crucial. And then the question becomes, how does sense, given that repositioning, how do sense and event relate? I think that if we disconnect event and sense, we end up, in a Kantian sense, I think, again, with a kind of an imperialistic, sensualist conception of the event. What I talked about, from a more metaphysical point of view, you end up with this strange, voluntaristic, abyssal dimension of the event. And I think what is crucial is that the event is something that is significant to us, even if it is a trauma, even if it interrupts everything that we are and can do. It is of high significance for who we are. And perhaps in the trauma we are no longer, the psychoanalysts know better than me, but perhaps we can no longer talk about it in the same way because we want to return again and again to the event, but it is significant. So this notion of sense, of significance, is, I think, crucial, and it stems from the encounter, from that which we encounter, or no, let's say from the encounter that the event is. I'm looking for the right words. So the event is itself an encounter with something, and it is an event because it is significant. And that's why I pushed a bit towards the end Gadamer's notion of Sinngeschehen. And I know that also gives rise to all kinds of resistance from several things, but I don't really know how to avoid speaking in that way about the event without it becoming only abyssal. But then, if it's abyssal, then the question is, what does that mean? So, for instance, we talked earlier about Kierkegaard. Of course, for Kierkegaard, if you have an event, it's also abyssal. But for Kierkegaard, that's of course very strategic, because it means that our relation to this event is not a thinking relation, but it is faith. So it's the notion of the abyss with respect to reason is used to open up another type of comportment. And I would like to keep it a thinking comportment. And if you want to keep it like that, I think that this notion of sense is inescapable. Yeah. So, well.
I'm Ferenc Pacs, Gregorian University. I was really very happy to hear your brilliant destruction of the calculative thinking, or this kind of voluntaristic way of thinking. And I was missing a little bit for a while the positive counterpart, which is the contemplative way of thinking. But you have arrived then to Angelus Silesius and the Ohne Warum, and also this kind of theoretical way of thinking, Aristotelian. And so I'm just wondering whether you have some positive, practical thoughts about the consequences of a new way of thinking, which is, let's hope, in the rise.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a difficult. It's a very open and therefore also a very difficult question. But what I think that perhaps I can say a little bit more about what I think is needed. I think that hermeneutic phenomenology started with an emphasis of the importance of the realm of praxis, let's say. And I think that was needed at the point that they did that. But I think that they lost sight a little bit of the positive contribution that the contemplation or the theoretical can still give. And I think the reason why they lost sight of it is because they understood the theoretical as identical to, let's say, the scientific gaze to the world that mathematizes the world, and so it's always reductive. And I think that's, but an author like Gadamer already shows, although he is also very often emphasizing praxis, he also shows in his reflections on the theoretical, on participation, that there is this possibility of thinking still open, even though we might need to rethink it. And so what I would like to do is to show why and in which sense this more contemplative way of thinking might be necessary. And one of the ideas I have is, for instance, that what is called Besinnung, whether it is in Dilthey or in Husserl or in Heidegger. I think it is a kind of a present-day version of that what we lost when we threw out the contemplative. And I think that the notion of witnessing is also, if you elaborate it in the right way, can be reworked in that direction. And one of the I already said something why I liked this notion of witnessing, but it's also an interesting notion because it is so close to everybody's own experience. We are all witnesses from time to time, and we all know how difficult it is then to talk about it. And we all know that to witness something is not the same as recording something like a camera or something like that, because all kinds of things happen when you're a witness. And so it becomes a very complicated relation to what appears. So it's in that direction that I would like to move a little bit. Yeah, I'm not sure whether this is not yet practical. But I will have to think about that better. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the whole presentation.